Pleasure to be here at Brown Trail. My wife's back there with the women. I hope none of the men went back there too. It's all right for them to come in here though if they want to. You know, I was sitting out here in the seat yesterday, and since you mentioned that I graduated from Pepperdine, it hit me when Roy Lanier said, "You can tell a preacher who came out of Pepperdine by the way he preaches, and you can tell a preacher who came out of Freed Hardeman by the way he preaches." And I hope you can't tell that I came out of Pepperdine by the way I preach. And when I was in school there, I was wishing that I was in Freed Hardeman, but I just didn't have enough money to get over there to go to school. But anyway, you do what you can, and so here I am, and they do let a few people out now and then who haven't totally apostatized just to prove that some can do it. But I appreciate the topic that we have before us at this hour. It is something that means a lot to me and to my wife and to our children, I might add, who went with us into the mission field overseas when they were young. And I think it's something that every gospel preacher and his family should experience, doing mission work, especially in some difficult place or place where Christ has never been preached, or some place where the borders of the kingdom need to be spread and have had very little preaching of the gospel. And so I think it makes a difference to the Lord, to his kingdom, to us as proclaimers of his word, and I might add to our families. Our children would not have been the children that they are, with the memories they have and the convictions they have, had it not been, I think, for some of the times that they remember spending in a far-off mission field of the world. Well, let me introduce really my thoughts this morning on mission work by reflecting a little bit on the early church. And I want to reflect on some things we read about in the book of Acts in particular. You know, Jesus told his apostles, he said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And then he told them to wait in Jerusalem till they be endued with power from on high. And then he said they would be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. And so these three thoughts, putting these three thoughts together from the Great Commission as we have it in Mark 16 and then Luke 24, Acts 1:8, just pulling out some of these main thoughts that we have on mission work that I think probably everybody in this room is familiar with. When you think about that commission and then you read what happened in the early chapters of the book of Acts, I don't know about you, but I have often wondered if the early church let the Lord down when it came to fulfilling the Great Commission. And here's what I mean. You well know that the church began, as far as human entry into it is concerned, in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. And there were about 3,000 people converted. And then shortly you read that the number was 5,000 men, not counting women. And then you read over in Acts 5 and verse 14, I believe it is, that there were more people added to the Lord. And then Acts 6 and verse 7, there were still more added. And so they were growing, and it seemed like they were growing by leaps and bounds. But as you go through those chapters, it struck me one day, somewhere along the way, that they were still in Jerusalem. What happened to Judea, the surrounding county, we would say? What happened to Samaria? What happened to the uttermost part of the earth? Why didn't they just get on with it and really energetically push the gospel on out where the Lord said it was supposed to go? And then you get up to Acts chapter 7, and you read about the martyrdom of Stephen, and then the early verses of Acts chapter 8, how great persecution broke out against the church. And when you read in verse 4 of that chapter that those who were scattered because of the persecution went about everywhere preaching the word, I began to wonder if maybe the Lord had a hand in bringing persecution upon his own church. Now, at first thought, that might seem like it would be an unthinkable thing. But then you stop and think about it. In the Old Testament times, when the people of God were not doing right. God often brought hardship and persecution upon them. He even brought invading armies in to teach them a lesson from time to time. And when you get over to the New Testament scriptures and you read some of the statements that Jesus made to some of those 7 congregations of Asia listed in Revelation 2 and 3, where Jesus warns them and says, if you don't shape up and do right, I'm going to bring something upon you. I'll come as a thief. I'll remove your candlestick or your lampstand. I'll spew you out of my mouth. I'll do this, I'll do that. And there are warnings there. And so I began to wonder, maybe the early church let the Lord down in regard to the speed with which they went about fulfilling the Great Commission. Maybe they were just too slow, and so the Lord brought the persecution in to get them scattered out there and start preaching the Word. I don't know. I suppose that's one of those questions I'm going to kind of write down and plug in the back of my mind somewhere and ask Paul or someone later on when I get to see him in heaven after all of this is over. But I know one thing. The Lord did take a divine hand in getting the gospel sent to some places. You get over to Acts 8, and here's an angel of the Lord who tells the preacher Philip, you go and join yourself to this chariot. And so God himself has to instigate the evangelism on that occasion. Here's a man from a foreign country. God is the one, through the angel, who gets that message proclaimed to this foreigner so that he can take it back to his homeland. And then you get up to Acts chapter 10, and here is an angel who visits Cornelius, a Gentile, and at the same time, over here in another location, Peter, the apostle, is up on a housetop, and God, by a vision, has to reveal to Peter that it's all right for him to receive the men who are going to be knocking on the door downstairs, who were sent from Cornelius. And so you see what's happening here. God is working on both ends of that arrangement. He's working on the first Gentile hearers to tell them who to send to get over there to preach the gospel to them, and then he's working on the preacher over here to get his heart right so that he will come to understand that it's all right for him to go and preach the gospel to Gentiles. And so God puts the two parties together, and finally the message is preached. But Peter's got some Jewish Christians with him, and they're not at all sure that they ought to be in this Gentile's house, much less preaching the gospel to them. And so God has to pour out the Holy Spirit upon these people as a demonstration of divine approval, that it's all right for Gentiles to become Christians. And so here's God taking a hand in getting the gospel spread out to the Gentile world. Why didn't the early church do that on their own? Why did it take all that divine intervention? Jesus had said, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the earth. Why didn't they understand that they should get the gospel out to the Gentiles? I don't know. It's a curiosity to me. And then we get up to Acts 13, where Paul's first missionary journey begins, and even there the Lord had to take a hand in getting that thing going. And so this Holy Spirit revealed the message and said, separate unto me Barnabas and Saul for the work whereunto I've called them. And so it took a divine special revelation to instigate the first, what we call, missionary journey to get the gospel out into other lands. So when I read all of that in the New Testament, I cannot help but feel that the early church was too slow in fulfilling the Great Commission. And when I come to that thought, and then think about us here near the end of the 20th century, I feel really convinced that we have been far, far too slow in getting the gospel out into all the world. Somehow in the first century, they did get the message out. As time went by and the missionary journeys of Paul unfolded and others got into that, and a lot of preaching was done. We read statements like we have in Colossians 1:6, Colossians 1:23 about the gospel going into all the world and being preached to every creature and so forth. But here we are at the end of the 20th century, and we're lagging further and further behind in evangelizing the world. People are being born faster then we are evangelizing. And so the hearers of the gospel are growing fewer and fewer in the percentage of the world population. And that kind of scares me. I think we have got to be on the lookout for every opportunity we have. And you know, one thing that hits me when I look at the missionary work of the Apostle Paul, that's so impressive to me, is that here was a man who was always looking for the open doors. Paul seemed to be the kind of man he just seemed to have it in mind all the time. Where is my next opportunity? Where's my next prospect? Where's my next city? How can I get in there? How can I preach the gospel there? You know, sometimes very difficult things came the way of Paul, and he had to endure a lot of persecution. He recounts some of that in the New Testament. And I can't help but be impressed with his stamina, his courage, his endurance. What a tremendous example to us the great Apostle Paul was. But then I read a statement about open doors in spite of everything that Paul endured, and it really impresses me with this great man. Do you remember what happened in Ephesus? When you get to Acts 19, you remember the Ephesian riot, how Paul went in there to preach the gospel, and the whole town just erupted in chaos, and people felt like their livelihood was threatened, and the whole town broke out into a riot, and they had this huge meeting in the amphitheater, and Paul was going to go in there, and the disciples were persuading him not to, and they wanted to get him out of town fast for fear that something bad would happen to him. It was from that place, Ephesus, that Paul wrote the 1 Corinthian letter, and in chapter 16, verse 9 of that letter, Paul said, "A great door and effectual has been opened unto me, and there are many adversaries." Paul saw the adversaries all right, but I want to tell you, he saw first the open door. And I cannot help but think that if you and I had been in Paul's place and had endured the things that Paul endured, we would have written back to someone and said, "There isn't any door open here. I'm getting out of town going somewhere else." Or maybe if we had been a little more positive than that, we might have said, "Well, a door started to be opened, but there are just too many adversaries, and so we've got to leave." Since 1993, my wife and I have been engaged in evangelism in the former Soviet Union. Hardship in preaching the gospel, not something that's especially new to us. We went before, I mentioned already, we did some foreign mission work. That was in Beirut, Lebanon. While we were there, we called it Dodge City because you had to kind of dodge the bullets. I remember one day I was driving from our home, which was up in the foothills, down into the city, and there was gunfire all over the place. This is after Civil War had erupted, and I heard gunfire, and I'm driving along by myself in the car. There's several cars around me, and I go a few blocks further, and all of a sudden I realize I'm the only car on the road, and I still hear the gunfire. That's a little scary feeling. I had my wife and I together in the car when we came up over a little hill rise on a major boulevard and found ourselves right behind the Lebanese army. There they were right in front of us with sandbags and machine guns firing off to the enemy across the other side, and we're right behind front lines. We kind of made a quick U-turn on that occasion and went to get our kids out of school and take them home. Passed a dead man on the street who'd been shot, came face to face with a tank and all that kind of thing. Hardship and danger was not exactly new to us when we started doing mission work in the former Soviet Union. And sometimes people get the idea that if the field is difficult, then you don't want to go there. Don't go there, go someplace easy. I came back from the Middle East and spoke to the Dallas Preachers Luncheon in 1975, and I remember what my topic was that morning, or that noon. I said, I want to encourage everyone to go to a difficult field. People who are willing to go to easy fields are a dime a dozen. How many are willing to go to a difficult field? Jesus said to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Why pick out just the easy places? But you know, the Lord has a way of turning difficult fields into productive fields. Now here we were over in the country of Ukraine, and by the way, let me interrupt myself to just identify where this is and what we're talking about when we say the former Soviet Union. Ukraine is one of the breakout independent republics that made up the 15 republics of what was the Soviet Union. And when you think of the Soviet Union, what it was, or just the biggest republic of that, which is Russia, when you think of that alone, you can, if you start looking at a map of the world, you realize how big of an area we're talking about. We think we live in a pretty big country here. 3,000 miles from coast to coast, 4 different time zones, pretty big country. You start looking at Western European countries and they look pretty small compared to ours. But when you get over there to Russia and you start looking at border to border, you realize that goes through 11 time zones. And the land that makes up what was the Soviet Union is 1/6 of the land of the world. That's a lot of territory. And you know what we did all these years while they were under communist rule? We just kind of shrugged it off for the most part and said, well, nobody can get the gospel in there. A few brethren smuggled Bibles across some borders, distributed a few, but nothing really came of any of those efforts. It was far too little, far too infrequent. And we generally had the idea, you just can't do it. Well, then the Soviet Union broke up without a shot. And by the way, you know, sometimes I'm not big on politics and worry about too much about what regime is in the White House and so forth and that sort of thing. But I want to tell you that sometimes God moves in the kingdoms of men. And I think significant things happen that we don't realize is something that God is doing behind the scenes. Do you remember when former President Reagan made that statement about the Soviet Union being the evil empire? Since we've been doing mission work over in the former Soviet Union, I've come to find out, or come to have a little different perspective on that statement. I remember when the statement was made, and of course I guess everybody was wondering, I wonder what they thought about his statement, how that impacted people over there. And I have come to find out that every last person in the former Soviet Union heard about it, it seems. Everybody I've ever run into where the subject has come up, they all knew about it. And the political leaders had a secret meeting out in the woods. Some of the presidents of some of those Soviet republics, and they were talking about Reagan's speech and his calling them the evil empire, and one of them said, you know what? He's right. This is an evil empire, and we need to disband it. And the Soviet Union fell apart without a shot being fired. That's one of the most amazing things that I have seen in my lifetime. Never would have imagined that anything like this would have come about. And all of a sudden, borders were open for people to come in openly where we thought we couldn't get in before. At least now it becomes obvious that we can get in. And so we start crossing borders. And we get in there, and that's how my wife and I got in 1993 and started doing some mission work in Ukraine and Russia. But I want to tell you, everywhere we go over there in that part of the world, we run into Pentecostals, Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists, so-called Jehovah's Witnesses, and Mormons. And all of those groups got in while the Soviet Union was still intact, when we said it couldn't be done. I want somebody to tell me how that happened. How'd they get in when we said we couldn't? And we run into people who have been in some of those churches that are aligned with those religious groups and have been aligned with them for years and years and years. We've been doing a lot of mission work in a city called Poltava in Ukraine. It's in central Ukraine, 323,000 people. And one of the Baptist preachers in that town was imprisoned for 8 years while the Soviet Union was still intact. He was imprisoned simply because he was a preacher of Christianity. And so there were those Baptists there. We were nowhere to be seen. We had never set foot in that city, and really not even in that country as far as I know. Well, it was in the summer of 1994 that a group of us decided we'd plant a new work on the right bank of the city of Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk, and that's more or less central Ukraine. And we rented a theater building. We started preaching. People started attending, and great opportunities opened up. People wanted to hear the gospel. One Seventh-day Adventist woman kept coming. I met her on the first day we did that. And I preached the first sermon in that effort. There were several of us involved. But then I noticed she started bringing friends with her. She'd have 3 or 4 people with her every time she came. And about the second or third time, we were preaching nightly there, and about the second or third time, she said, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. I want to invite you to come to our church meeting next Saturday. And I said, well, I can't next Saturday. We've got a schedule lined out this week and next week, already have that time slot filled, but 3 weeks from now, we'll come. And she said, okay, I'll be looking for you. So we made good our word. My wife and I went, showed up at the Adventist church meeting, sat down. 2 men walked up to me and said, would you preach the sermon this morning? And I said, nah, I don't believe I could do that. No, not really. I said, well, I believe I maybe could do that. And then one man said, we just have one request, that you not touch on any of our most painful questions, because after all, you know we are Adventists. Now, that's the Russian way. When they say painful questions, that means controversial questions. In other words, they didn't want me to preach how it was wrong to meet on the Sabbath day instead of Sunday. And so if I would abide by that request, well, then that'd be fine. Just don't condemn them too badly, on the spot. Well, I thought, why not take advantage of this invitation? I'm not going to betray their trust and say, yes, I'll do that, and then get up and do otherwise. So I thought, I'll just get up and preach a gospel sermon. We'll see what happens, what kind of doors open up here if I do that. And so I preached a sermon that had nothing to do with the fact that they meet on Saturday or anything like that, or that distinguishes them as Adventists. Just preached a sermon that they could not object to because of that denominational slant. And I finished the sermon, but before I could make my way to the seat, a man raised his hand. He said, could you stay up there a while longer and answer some questions? And I said, well, sure. And so all kinds of hands went up, and they began asking questions like, what's the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Are we under the 10 Commandments today? What about the command to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy? Well, see, it wasn't my fault that they asked those questions. I had to answer them, And so I got to tell them the truth on their errors, in spite of the fact that they really didn't want it to go that way. And after the whole thing was over, before we could get out of the place, they sent a boy outside to the street to buy a couple of bouquets of flowers and brought them in and presented one to me and one to my wife and said, please come back again and do this on another occasion. The Lord opens doors. In fact, it was the next day one of those people was present in our worship assembly. And even before that day was out, I got a phone call from a man. He said, hello, my name's Henry. It wasn't really. That was the nearest English equivalent. He said, you met my wife this morning at the Adventist church. And I said, oh, yes. He told me her name was Olga. And I said, yes, I remember Olga. Very friendly woman. He said, I'd like to invite you and your wife to come with us out to our dacha. That's a little country cottage with a garden plot, and we'll have strawberries and cream this evening. I said, great, we'll come. We went out there. We started a relationship with those people, started teaching the gospel to them. But then we had to come back pretty shortly, and my wife and I were talking, and we said, we really ought to tell Henry and Olga when we're coming back so we can continue these studies. And so we decided to walk over to their apartment, which was not too far from where we were. We got into the wrong building. We went up to the right floor, turned the right direction, knocked on the door to the right as we knew we were supposed to, but we just didn't realize we were in the wrong building. A strange woman came to the door, and I said, "Oh, we must be in the wrong building. We're looking for Gennady and Olga." And she said, "No, wrong place." I said, "Could I use your telephone? I have their phone number." She said, "Sure, come in." So used the telephone. And after I hung up, she said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "America." She said, "Can you come to dinner tomorrow?" Well, now, what gospel preacher ever turns down a dinner invitation, right? I said, "Sure." "What time?" She said, "Anytime you want to come. What time would you like to come?" They eat their big meal in the middle of the day, so I said, "How about 11 o'clock in the morning?" She said, "That's fine." So we went at 11 o'clock in the morning. There was the woman, there was her husband, there were her children, there was her best friend, there were her best friend's children, all jammed around this table. And we had a great meal together, a lively Bible discussion. 2 of those people were present that evening for our Bible study and singing. 3 of those people were present the next day in our regular worship assembly, Sunday morning. And you see how one thing leads to another. And doors just somehow open. It's amazing. Paul was a man who was always looking for the open doors. And after he wrote that in 1 Corinthians, then he wrote the 2 Corinthian letter, and he got to chapter 2, verse 12, and he said, "When I came to Troas, a door was opened unto me in the Lord." I think it should be translated by the Lord. In fact, one of the more recent translations, I think it's New King James, does have it, by the Lord. The Lord is the one who opens doors. All you have to do is read Revelation 3, 7 and 8 to find that out, where Jesus says, "I open doors that nobody can shut." And by the way, he said he shuts doors that nobody can open. And when it comes to opportunities to doing mission work, I worry sometimes about how long the door is going to stay open. We've been over there now in Ukraine for more than 3 years, and I have seen a lot of restrictions come into place during that time. When we first went in, we were preaching in that theater building. You could go into a city, you could preach without having to get permission from anybody. Large crowds would come and so forth. And so it was in the fall of that year, that would have been 94, when my interpreter, Sergei, he said, "I'm from the town of the city of Poltava, over 300,000 people." He said that nobody has set foot in this town. Not a member of the church that I know of has set foot in this town to preach the gospel. Why don't we go there? And I said, "Let's catch a bus and let's go check it out and survey the situation, see if we can find a place where we can preach, a place where we can stay, and so forth." So we caught a bus, he and I and my wife. We're sitting on one side of the bus, 2 seats on this side, 2 seats on this side, with an aisle in between. Sergei's across the aisle from me here, and there's a man sitting next to him. They're engaged in a conversation a lot of the way, and finally the bus pulls in for a pit stop, and I got a look at the man that Sergei had been talking to. Had a denim jacket on. Right up here it said U.S. Army on the lapel. But I observed that they had been speaking in Russian. So I walked up to this man and I said to him in Russian, I said, "What kind of work do you do?" And he said, "I'm a soldier in the Ukrainian army." And I said, "Do Ukrainian soldiers wear jackets that say U.S. Army?" And he said, "Only on our days off." And so, here is a man who wanted to wear a U.S. Army, and I started seeing American brands of clothing and hearing American songs being played on buses and trains and everywhere you go. And I want to tell you, those people over there that were part of what we thought was the great superpower, our enemy, that wanted to wipe us off the face of the map, those people want to be like us, look like us, talk like us, act like us. They really like Americans. And that's one of the most amazing things to me in the downfall of the Soviet Union. We went into that city, we scouted out the opportunity. On December 1st, 1994, we rolled into town to plant the gospel there. And we just rented a big public hall. And we went in there. I preached the first sermon. I had another American preacher with me, and I had a young Ukrainian preacher from the city of Dnipro where we had been, who had only been preaching less than a year and had no formal training of any kind. He was converted, and somebody said, "Here, you're going to be the preacher. get after it." But he was a great student of the Bible, this young man, and would get up and deliver his lessons without a note and never miss a beat. It was so heartwarming to hear that young man preach. And I wanted him to come along with us, preach some sermons in Russian without translation, so that these people in Poltava could hear some along that line. Everything went well for the first few days. In fact, on the very first night when we started that, as I got up to speak, here came a little short woman walking down the aisle. I asked her months later, I said, "Exactly how tall are you?" And she told me in centimeters, and it turned out to be 4'9". So she's real short. But she came down the aisle, took a seat. I preached the sermon. After the sermon was over, she walked up to me with a great big beaming smile on her face, and that was unusual for people over in that part of the world, to be smiling like that in public. They don't normally do that. The guy right next to him might have been a KGB agent. He'll wonder what they were up to, you know. So they were kind of trained not to do that. And she said, I'm actually not from the city of Poltava here. I live in a village not far away, and there are people there that would like to hear the gospel. Could you come over there and present some lessons? And I said, "You set it up and I'll come. I have another American here to preach and a young man from Ukraine here to preach. You set it up. Anytime you can set it up, I'll come over." She came back the next day and said, "It's on for Sunday at 5 o'clock. And I said, "Okay." And so she came early on Sunday and led us over there by train so that we could get to the right place. There were 27 people jammed into an apartment ready to hear the gospel. And I told them who we were, why we'd come to their country, and that we were there to spread the gospel. Asked them, maybe some of you have some questions you'd like to ask us. Do you have any questions? Everybody just sat there, very timid. I said, "Well, let me tell you some things from the Bible, and maybe you'll have some questions afterwards." So for an hour, I told them how the church was established and how they could become a Christian. And then I said, "Now, are there any questions?" All kinds of hands went up, and I found out who we had then. We had atheists, we had Pentecostals, we had Baptists, we had just a complete mixture of people. And one young man said, "If there is a God, then how could dinosaurs have lived so long before men?" And I said, "Oh, you need to come to Glen Rose, Texas, to the Paluxy River." He said, "I'm not against that." And see, I said, the dinosaur footprints along the river bank. I was down there again just over the holidays with some of my family. Very interesting. The old dinosaur just walked along the river one day. And right out there with it is a human footprint. And so I told them about that. But we had 2 hours of discussion. And they said, "Come back again." I said, "When?" They said, "Next Friday, 5 o'clock. And so we made a date. Meanwhile, on the 6th day of our preaching in Poltava, here comes a stern-looking man in the door, and he said, "I want to speak to whoever's in charge." He said this to my wife's interpreter, a young lady helping her. And this girl walked over to me and said, "This man wants to speak to whoever's in charge." I said, "Have him speak to Alosha," the young man from Dnipro, 19 years old. I said, "Have him speak to him." Well, my interpreter, Sergei, got in on that conversation. He turned to me a minute or two later and he said, he's not satisfied just talking with him. He wants to speak to the Americans. I said, "Okay, what is it?" And this man said, "By what authority are you here doing this?" And I said, "Oh, well, we didn't have any authority. We just came in to preach the gospel and present Bible lessons." He said, "What registered church invited you?" I said, "We not only don't have a registered church here, we don't have any church here. We just came in to present Bible lectures in this place for whoever might want to hear them." He said, "You can't do that. Laws have been enacted prohibiting you from doing that unless you have an invitation from a registered church." And he pulls out of his pocket a copy of the law. And he said, "Now what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I guess we'll have to stop then." He said, okay, but I'm going to report this to the passport office, the American embassy, and he named off a couple of other agencies. And then he left. And I told everybody, I said, we're staying in the hotel right around the corner. Just come over there at the same times we've been meeting here, and that was 3 times a day. We'll just keep our Bible studies going over there. And you know what? They came. And we got our first baptisms as a result of that. Some of those people kind of clenched their teeth and dug in their heels, and they said, he can't stop us from hearing the gospel. We're ready to become Christians. A little opposition is what motivated them to go ahead and take the step and actually become Christians. Meanwhile, the passport office called up the next day. We had to go see them, and the guy said, you have no right to be in this city. Your visa says Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk. And he ordered us out of town. Our interpreter said, what if there's no transportation on short notice? He said, let them vanish. Kind of like an old Western movie. You be out of town by sundown or else someone will come shooting for you. I was wishing I had John Wayne around to help me out, but I didn't, so we caught the bus. Went back to Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk. Got back there, went into the apartment of where we had lived for about 6 months. And the woman there made a phone call to 2 or 3 people and told them we were back in town. And then a phone call came back. And this woman, member of the church there, Ukrainian woman, said, I have a friend who wants to hear the gospel. Could you come and teach her? And I said, sure. And we took out in the dark of night, maybe 8, 9 o'clock, walked for about a mile through real freezing weather, got over to that apartment, found the place full of her family and her neighbors. And for about 3 hours had a Bible study, at the end of which she said, I want to become a Christian tonight. And I said to her husband, I said, would you run the water in the tub? We baptize most people in bathtubs over there. Fortunately, they're pretty good size. We've come close to not getting some people under, but so far we've made it. And he came in a few minutes later and said, would you come and check the water? And I went in, and I didn't know what was wrong. I went in and looked, and the water in that town is the color of iced tea or Coca-Cola. It was just as brown as it could be. And I said, oh, don't worry about that. Jesus was baptized in the muddy Jordan River. It doesn't make any difference. He said, no, I'm talking about the temperature. Just wanted you to check that. So I put my finger in. I said, yeah, it's fine. And so we baptized that woman into Christ. Within 2 months, she died. And I have often thought, what would have happened if we hadn't been ordered out of town, we hadn't preached the gospel to that woman? She never would have been a saved individual. As a result of her conversion, her daughter was converted. And one thing led to another. And I tell you, when you work the mission fields of the world, you start thinking of individuals. You start thinking of individuals. Where is my next person? Who am I going to speak to today? And over there in what seems like to some maybe would be a formidable place to spread the gospel. It's not, are there any opportunities here? It's never a question like that. The question is, out of all of these opportunities, out of all of the people we could talk to today, which ones should we select? And how can we best use our time? And I want to tell you, it is a thrill to preach the gospel to people who have never heard it before. Have you ever stood in a place and told someone, either in a public setting or privately, about Jesus Christ and been the first person to ever mention the name of your Lord? The name of Jesus to someone? Been the first person to ever show them a copy of the Bible? I brought along a letter that one of our converts, in fact, that little lady, Paulina, who came down the aisle that I mentioned to you, 4'9", she became a Christian. She was one of our first converts in the city. She wrote a letter to my mother about a year later. This is dated December 1995. She said, I remember how it was in the beginning when we first got together with the American preachers and their wives. It was very cold inside the building. It was uncomfortable and people did not know each other, but we listened to the sermons with great interest. And she said, I am almost 70, but I have known God quite lately. I did not believe that there was a God and did not believe in salvation in Christ either. What a spiritually dark person I was. I had never seen the Bible. It is said in the scriptures that one who is seeking God with all his heart will find him. I realized it when I started to attend the meetings, read the Bible, and meditate on it. It was difficult at first for me to determine which church to belong to. But when your preachers came to us in Poltava, Ukraine, I believed it was God who brought me together with them. It could not be otherwise. Of course, I could not hear his voice, but I felt with my heart that it was the thing that was very necessary for me, and I didn't doubt the truth at all. The first birth is a natural birth. The second birth happens when a person subjects his life to God. I was born again. I am a Christian, and I take pride in it. And then she said, Jesus Christ is invisible, but he is next to me. My life has changed so much. I want to throw out a challenge to every gospel preacher, every serious Bible student here, and tell you, I challenge you to go to a mission field of the world. You have an opportunity that I don't have. You have your unique place in life. You will meet people that I will never meet. I will meet people that you will never meet. We cannot cross each other's paths and duplicate them exactly. And I think that if I had not gone to that city, that woman would never have become a Christian. She went on to say, after she said, my life has changed so much, she said, now she's writing this to my mother, and this is kind of a personal letter, but I think you'll see the point. She said, it happened mainly thanks to your son, Gary. I am thankful to you from the bottom of my heart that you have him. Now he is also ours. I consider both him and Katrinka to be my children, and certainly a brother and a sister. I am thankful from my heart to the brothers and sisters in America that they have had such a wonderful opportunity to send to us in Ukraine their preachers with the Word of God. I love both them and you. I will pray for you and all the sisters and brothers who help us with the preachers who come to us. For Gary and Katrinka, I always pray and miss them very much when they leave for America. I was going to get Maxie to read this letter. I wasn't sure I could get through it, but then I'm not sure he could get through it either. But brethren, here's the point. Here's the point. You could be getting letters like that from your Paulinas and whoever else it might be. And you as gospel preachers could do a tremendous service to the cause of Christ, even if you could only go over on short trips, 2 or 3 weeks. Elders who are here, I want to encourage you to send preachers and go yourselves if you have the opportunity. And get the gospel out. Any and all help will do something. And the gospel of Christ will be spread, and the Lord's church will be its great beneficiary. Thank you so much.